Picture this. You're a wealthy merchant in the 14th century London, and you've just received an invitation to the finest public bathhouse in the city. You dress in your best robes, gather your coins, and make your way through the muddy streets with excitement. This is your chance to finally get clean after weeks of grime and sweat. You push open the heavy wooden doors and step inside, expecting luxury and cleanliness. Instead, you're hit with a wall of steam so thick you can barely see 3 feet ahead of you. The air reeks of unwashed bodies, rotting wood, and something else you can't quite identify but makes your stomach turn. As your eyes adjust, you see dozens of naked bodies crammed into murky pools of water that looks more like soup than anything meant for bathing. A woman beside you is picking lice from her hair and casually flicking them into the communal water. A man across the pool is relieving himself without bothering to leave his spot. In the corner, what appears to be a corpse floats face down, while other bathers simply move around it as if nothing unusual is happening. You realize with growing horror that this isn't just a bathhouse. It's a breeding ground for disease, a marketplace for, and quite possibly the most dangerous place you could spend an afternoon in medieval Europe. Welcome to the reality of medieval bathing, where the cure was often worse than the dirt itself. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Most people think they understand medieval hygiene. We imagine dirty peasants who never bathed, living in filth because they didn't know any better. But that's not the whole story. Medieval people actually bathed quite regularly, and they understood the connection between cleanliness and health far better than we give them credit for. The problem wasn't that they avoided bathing. The problem was what happened when they tried to get clean. Medieval bathhouses weren't just places to wash. They were complex social institutions that served as everything from medical centers to gambling dens to brothels. And the bathing practices that developed around them created some of the most horrifying sanitary conditions in human history. What you're about to discover will make you grateful for every hot shower you've ever taken, and will completely change how you think about medieval life. The story begins in the 12th century when public bathhouses started appearing in every major European city. These weren't primitive affairs. Many were elaborate multi-story buildings with sophisticated heating systems, separate sections for men and women, and amenities that wouldn't look out of place in a modern spa. The wealthy merchants and nobility who built them understood that cleanliness was profitable. People would pay good money for a proper bath, especially in an era when most homes had no running water, and heating enough water for a full bath required burning expensive fuel for hours. But here's where things get interesting and disturbing. The medieval understanding of medicine and hygiene was based on the theory of the 4 humors. According to this system, illness was caused by imbalances in blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Bathing was seen as a way to balance these humors by opening the pores and allowing bad humors to escape while good ones entered. This sounds reasonable until you realize what it meant in practice. Medieval physicians recommended that people bathe in water heated to specific temperatures depending on their individual humoral constitution. Hot water was prescribed for people with cold and moist conditions, while cooler water was recommended for those with hot and dry temperaments. But determining someone's humoral balance required examining their urine, checking their pulse, and sometimes tasting their sweat or other bodily fluids. Imagine a medieval doctor licking your armpit to determine what temperature bath you needed, and you're starting to understand how medical science worked in this era. The bathhouse attendants, who were often the same people providing medical advice, would examine each customer and prescribe not just water temperature but also various additives that were supposed to enhance the therapeutic effects. These additives included herbs, oils, wine, and sometimes more disturbing substances like ground animal bones, crushed insects, or human urine from people believed to have complementary humoral balances. But the real horror began when you actually entered the water. Medieval bathhouses operated on what we might charitably call a recycling system. Water was expensive to heat and transport, so the same water would be used by dozens or even hundreds of people before being changed. The process worked like this. The bathhouse would fill its pools early in the morning with fresh water. The first customers, usually wealthy patrons who paid premium prices, would get relatively clean water. As the day progressed and more people used the same water, it would become increasingly contaminated. By afternoon, the water in a busy bathhouse would be thick with soap scum, dead skin, hair, and bodily fluids from dozens of previous bathers. The attendants would occasionally skim debris from the surface and add fresh hot water to maintain temperature, but they rarely changed the water completely. Some bathhouses boasted that their water was so therapeutically potent from accumulated medicinal herbs and bodily humors that it became more beneficial as more people used it. The customers seemed to accept this system, partly because they didn't understand how disease spread, and partly because the social aspects of bathing were as important as the cleanliness. Medieval bathhouses were places where people conducted business, arranged marriages, gossiped about politics, and formed social connections. The wealthy would bring servants to scrub their backs, musicians to provide entertainment, and sometimes entire meals to enjoy while soaking. The poor would crowd together in the cheaper sections, sharing soap and towels while discussing the events of their daily lives. But sharing facilities meant sharing everything else too. Skin diseases spread rapidly through the contaminated water. Open wounds became infected with bacteria from other bathers. Parasites like lice and fleas found paradise in the warm, humid environment. And diseases that we now know are transmitted through bodily fluids had perfect conditions to spread from person to person. The medieval understanding of contagion was limited and often backwards. Many people believed that diseases were caused by bad air or evil spirits, rather than by contact with infected people or contaminated water. This meant that sick people often continued using bathhouses even when they were highly contagious. Lepers were sometimes banned from public baths, but people with less visible diseases like syphilis, tuberculosis, or plague were often welcomed as long as they could pay. The attendants who worked in these bathhouses faced constant exposure to every disease and parasite carried by their customers. They would move from person to person, scrubbing backs, washing hair, and providing various services without any understanding of hygiene or disease transmission. Many bathhouse workers developed chronic skin conditions, respiratory problems, and other health issues that were accepted as occupational hazards. The situation was made worse by the additional services that many bathhouses provided. Sexual services were common, and the distinction between bathhouse attendant and prostitute was often blurred. This meant that sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly through both workers and customers. The warm, moist environment was perfect for bacteria and viruses, and the practice of sharing facilities meant that infections could spread to dozens of people in a single day. Medieval people did recognize that some bathhouses were cleaner and safer than others. The most expensive establishments changed their water more frequently, employed more attendants to maintain cleanliness, and sometimes required customers to bring their own towels and soap. But even the finest bathhouses operated under the same basic assumptions about medicine and hygiene that made all of them dangerous by modern standards. The social dynamics of medieval bathing created additional problems. Bathhouses were often the only places where people of different social classes would interact in a state of undress. This led to tensions, violence, and sometimes riots. Wealthy customers expected preferential treatment and would sometimes demand that poorer bathers be removed from their pools. Arguments over water temperature, bathing order, and service quality could escalate into serious conflicts. The legal system struggled to regulate bathhouses because they served so many different functions. Were they medical facilities subject to physician oversight? Were they businesses that needed commercial licenses? Were they entertainment venues that required moral supervision? The confusion meant that many bathhouses operated with minimal oversight, allowing dangerous and exploitative practices to continue unchecked. Religious authorities were similarly conflicted about bathhouses. On one hand, cleanliness was considered next to godliness, and many religious texts emphasize the importance of washing before prayer. On the other hand, the nakedness, mixed gender socializing, and sexual activities associated with bathhouses made them seem morally suspect. Some religious leaders tried to ban bathhouses entirely, while others attempted to regulate them by requiring separate bathing times for men and women, or prohibiting certain activities. The result was a patchwork of regulations that varied from city to city and were often ignored by bathhouse operators who had more immediate concerns about profit and customer satisfaction. This lack of consistent oversight meant that dangerous practices could continue for decades without intervention, and customers had little recourse when they contracted diseases or suffered injuries from contaminated facilities. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval bathing culture was how it reflected broader attitudes about the human body and social hierarchy. The wealthy could afford cleaner water and better facilities, while the poor had to accept whatever conditions were available. This meant that disease and parasites were concentrated among the lower classes, who then carried them back to their crowded living quarters, where they could spread further. The system also reinforced gender inequalities. Women often had access to bathhouses only at certain times or in designated areas that were smaller and less well-maintained than men's facilities. Female bathhouse attendants were particularly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, and they had little legal protection if customers or employers mistreated them. Medieval bathing practices reveal a society that understood the importance of cleanliness, but lacked the scientific knowledge to achieve it safely. The elaborate systems they developed for heating water, managing facilities, and providing services showed remarkable ingenuity and social organization. But their fundamental misunderstanding of how disease spreads turned these achievements into instruments of suffering and death. The bathhouse culture that flourished in medieval Europe created a perfect storm of conditions for disease transmission, social exploitation, and human misery disguised as health and luxury. And we've only begun to scratch the surface of how deeply these problems penetrated medieval society and how they shaped the daily lives of everyone from kings to peasants. The consequences of these filthy bathing practices extended far beyond individual discomfort or even disease. Medieval bathhouses became epicenters of social breakdown that fundamentally altered how entire communities functioned. When disease outbreaks began, they didn't spread randomly through populations. They followed the social networks created by shared bathing facilities, creating patterns of death and suffering that seemed to target specific neighborhoods, social groups, and economic classes. Consider what happened in the 14th century Paris when a particularly virulent outbreak of what medieval chroniclers called the bathing sickness swept through the city's most popular bathhouse district. The disease, which modern historians believe was likely a combination of dysentery and skin infections, didn't affect everyone equally. It struck first and hardest among the regular bathhouse patrons, merchants, craftsmen, and minor nobility, who could afford frequent bathing. These were precisely the people who kept the city's economy functioning. As these middle-class citizens fell ill and died, their businesses collapsed, trade relationships dissolved, and the delicate web of credit and commerce that sustained medieval urban life began to unravel. The poor, who couldn't afford regular bathing, initially seemed protected from the worst effects. But as the economic system collapsed around them, they faced starvation and homelessness that proved just as deadly as any disease. The wealthy, meanwhile, retreated to their private estates outside the city, taking their capital and connections with them. What had begun as a sanitation problem in a few bathhouses cascaded into a complete social and economic collapse that took decades to recover from. This pattern repeated itself across medieval Europe whenever bathing-related disease outbreaks occurred, creating a cycle of urban decline that historians are only now beginning to understand. But the physical dangers of medieval bathing were matched by psychological torments that were equally devastating. The medieval mind understood the world through a lens of spiritual symbolism, and cleanliness was directly connected to moral purity. When people became sick after bathing, which happened frequently, They faced not just physical suffering, but profound spiritual crisis. Imagine being a devout Christian who has saved money for months to afford a proper bath, believing that cleanliness will bring you closer to God and wash away your sins. You enter the bathhouse with hope and reverence, submitting to what you believe is a sacred ritual of purification. But instead of emerging spiritually renewed, you develop painful sores, violent stomach illness, or a fever that leaves you delirious for weeks. In the medieval worldview, this wasn't just bad luck or poor sanitation. It was a sign that God was displeased with you, that your sins were so great that even the sacred act of cleansing couldn't purify your soul. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. People would spend their recovery periods, if they recovered at all, in agonizing self-examination, trying to identify which sins had made them unworthy of cleanliness. Medieval medical texts from this period are filled with case studies of patients who developed what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders after contracting diseases from bathhouses. They describe people who became convinced that they were cursed, that their bodies were fundamentally corrupted, that they were destined for eternal damnation. Some refused to eat, believing they didn't deserve. Others engaged in extreme self-punishment, whipping themselves or sleeping on beds of thorns in attempts to atone for whatever sins had caused their illness. The bathhouse attendants who witnessed this suffering day after day developed their own psychological problems. Many became convinced that they were agents of divine punishment, that their role was to test people's worthiness through the trial of bathing. Some began deliberately making the water more contaminated, adding dirt, refuse, or even dead animals to the pools while telling customers that this would make their spiritual cleansing more complete. Others went in the opposite direction, becoming obsessed with purification rituals that bordered on madness. They would spend hours each day cleaning and re-cleaning facilities that were fundamentally unsanitary, performing elaborate blessing ceremonies over contaminated water, and developing increasingly complex theories about which combinations of herbs and prayers would make the bathing experience truly holy. The customers who survived repeated bathhouse visits often developed a form of what modern psychologists might recognize as trauma bonding with their suffering. They became convinced that the pain and illness they experienced after bathing were necessary parts of spiritual growth. Some formed cults around particularly dangerous bathhouses, believing that the higher the risk of disease and death, the greater the potential for spiritual purification. These spiritual bath cults developed elaborate initiation rituals where new members would be required to bathe in the most contaminated pools during the most dangerous times of day. They would drink the bathwater, cover themselves with the scum that floated on the surface, and deliberately expose themselves to sick bathers in attempts to prove their faith. The mortality rate among cult members was extraordinarily high, but survivors often became fanatically devoted to recruiting new victims. The economic exploitation that surrounded medieval bathing was equally horrifying. Bathhouse owners quickly realized that desperate sick customers would pay almost anything for promised cures or spiritual cleansing. They began selling increasingly expensive premium services that were often more dangerous than the basic bathing experience. For additional fees, customers could bathe in water that had been blessed by corrupt priests, mixed with expensive but useless herbs or heated with wood from sacred trees. They could pay to have their bodies scrubbed with brushes made from the hair of martyred saints, or to soak in pools where pieces of religious relics had been dissolved. None of these services provided any medical benefit, but they gave customers the psychological comfort of believing they were receiving the best possible treatment. The most expensive service was private bathing in water that had supposedly never been used by anyone else. Wealthy customers would pay enormous sums for this privilege, not realizing that bathhouse owners simply moved the same contaminated water from pool to pool while claiming it was fresh. The deception was perfect because medieval people had no way to test water purity scientifically, and the visible contamination that would have warned them was hidden by darkness, steam, and deliberately murky conditions. Some bathhouses began offering medical treatments that were actually forms of torture disguised as therapy. Customers with skin conditions would be scrubbed with brushes embedded with metal bristles, tearing away healthy skin along with diseased tissue. People with joint pain would be stretched on medieval racks, under the pretense that this would realign their humors. Those suffering from fever would be submerged in alternating hot and cold pools until they went into shock, which attendants claimed was a sign that evil spirits were leaving their bodies. The most vulnerable customers were those who came to bathhouses seeking cures for conditions that medieval medicine couldn't treat. Lepers who were banned from most public facilities would pay desperate prices for access to special pools that were supposed to cure their condition. These pools were typically the most contaminated in the facility, often located in basements or other areas where diseased water collected. The lepers who bathed in these conditions almost always died from secondary infections, but their deaths were attributed to divine will rather than human negligence. Mental illness was another condition that drove people to seek bathhouse treatments that made their problems worse. Medieval understanding of psychological disorders was primitive at best, and many believed that madness was caused by evil spirits that could be washed away through proper bathing. Mentally ill customers were often restrained and forcibly submerged in scalding water, while attendants performed exorcism rituals. The trauma of these experiences typically worsened their conditions, but any temporary quiet that followed shock treatment was interpreted as evidence that the demons had been successfully expelled. The children who were brought to medieval bathhouses suffered perhaps the worst fate of all. Parents genuinely trying to keep their children healthy would expose them to diseases and parasites that their young immune systems couldn't fight. Infant mortality rates in families that used bathhouses regularly were significantly higher than among those who relied on simple washing at home, but this correlation wasn't understood at the time. Children who survived repeated bathhouse visits often developed chronic health conditions that affected them for life. Respiratory problems from inhaling contaminated steam, skin conditions from exposure to diseased water, and digestive disorders from accidentally ingesting bathwater were common among young bathhouse patrons. Many grew up believing that constant illness was normal, that healthy people were somehow blessed by God rather than simply avoiding dangerous sanitary practices. The most tragic cases involved children who were sold or apprenticed to bathhouses. These young people, often as young as 8 or 9 years old, would spend their entire days in the contaminated environment, developing severe health problems before they reached adulthood. Many died before age 20, their bodies unable to withstand the constant exposure to disease and toxic substances. Those who survived were often permanently disabled, unable to work anywhere else, and trapped in the same system that had destroyed their health. But the bathhouse system's cruelty extended beyond physical harm. It created and reinforced social hierarchies based on who could afford to risk their health in pursuit. The wealthy could hire servants to test water temperature and quality before entering pools themselves. They could afford private facilities that were slightly less contaminated. They could pay physicians to treat the diseases they inevitably contracted from bathing. The poor had no such options. They had to accept whatever conditions were available, often bathing in water that had already been used by dozens of other people. When they became sick, they had no access to medical treatment and often died from conditions that could have been managed with proper care. Their deaths were rarely recorded or investigated, making it impossible for medieval authorities to understand the true scope of the public health crisis they had created. This system of medical apartheid extended to every aspect of creating a world where your social class determined not just your comfort, but your likelihood of survival. The bathhouse workers themselves developed an intricate caste system that reflected and amplified these social divisions. At the top were the master bathkeepers, usually wealthy merchants who owned multiple facilities but rarely set foot in them. Below them were the facility managers, who handled day-to-day operations while trying to minimize their own exposure to the contaminated environment. Then came the regular attendants, who did most of the actual work of maintaining pools and serving customers. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the water carriers and waste removers, people whose job was to handle the most contaminated materials. These workers would scoop out floating debris, drain and refill pools, and clean the areas where customers relieved themselves. They had the highest exposure to disease and the lowest pay, creating a class of people who were essentially sacrificed to maintain the illusion that bathhouses were clean and safe. The water carriers developed their own survival strategies that revealed just how dangerous their work environment was. They would wrap their hands and arms in layers of cloth soaked in wine or vinegar, believing this would protect them from contamination. They learned to hold their breath while working near the most polluted pools, and many developed the ability to work almost entirely by touch in the dim, steamy conditions that characterized most bathhouses. But perhaps most telling was their practice of creating secret signals to warn each other about particularly dangerous conditions. A certain arrangement of towels might indicate that someone with a highly contagious disease was using a specific pool. A particular way of hanging brushes could signal that the water in a section hadn't been changed for several days. These workers developed an entire underground communication system designed to help them survive their daily exposure to lethal conditions. The diseases that spread through medieval bathhouses weren't just the obvious ones like skin infections and stomach ailments. The warm, humid environment created perfect conditions for respiratory diseases that could kill entire families. Tuberculosis spread rapidly through the steam-filled air, with infected droplets traveling from person to person in the enclosed spaces. Many customers would arrive healthy and leave carrying diseases that would kill them weeks or months later, never connecting their illness to their bathing experience. The contaminated water also harbored parasites that were virtually unknown in other environments. Medieval chroniclers describe mysterious worms that would burrow under people's skin after bathhouse visits, creating painful infections that could last for years. Modern historians believe these were likely tropical parasites that survived in the artificially warm conditions of heated bathhouses, finding new hosts among the urban populations that had no natural immunity to such organisms. Eye infections were so common among regular bathhouse patrons that partial blindness was considered almost inevitable among people who bathed frequently. The combination of contaminated water, harsh soaps made from animal fat and ash, and steam that carried particles of debris created perfect conditions for bacterial infections of the eyes and surrounding tissues. Many medieval depictions of wealthy merchants and nobles show them with clouded or damaged eyes, a testament to their regular use of public bathing facilities. The psychological adaptation that people develop to cope with these conditions reveals the incredible human capacity for self-deception in the face of unbearable reality. Regular bathhouse patrons convinced themselves that the pain and illness they experienced after bathing were signs that the treatment was working, that their bodies were purging evil influences and becoming spiritually purified. They interpreted fever as evidence that bad humors were being burned away, skin eruptions as proof that internal corruption was being expelled, and digestive problems as indications that their bodies were being internally cleansed. This rationalization extended to the deaths that occurred regularly in and around bathhouses. When someone died during or shortly after bathing, it was often attributed to their spiritual unworthiness, rather than to the dangerous conditions they had been exposed to. Families would sometimes compete to have their deceased relatives associated with particularly holy or powerful bathhouses, believing that dying from bathhouse-related illness was evidence of divine selection rather than negligent homicide. The medieval medical establishment enthusiastically supported these interpretations because they provided intellectual cover for practices that were obviously harmful but economically profitable. Physicians developed elaborate theories about how the suffering associated with bathing was actually therapeutic, necessary for achieving proper humoral balance. They created detailed charts showing how different types of pain corresponded to the expulsion of specific bad humors, giving customers a framework for understanding their suffering as beneficial rather than harmful. Some medical schools began requiring students to spend time working in bathhouses as part of their training, not to learn about sanitation or disease prevention, but to observe the supposed healing processes that occurred during communal bathing. These student physicians would document the various diseases and conditions they observed, but they interpreted everything through the lens of humoral theory rather than recognizing the obvious patterns of contamination and infection. The result was a generation of medical professionals who were trained to see disease transmission as spiritual purification and who actively promoted practices that modern medicine recognizes as lethal. These physicians carried their bathhouse-trained misconceptions into other areas of medical, creating a healthcare system that was often more dangerous than no treatment at all. The religious implications of medieval bathing culture extended far beyond individual spiritual concerns. Many bathhouses were built adjacent to churches or monasteries, with religious authorities claiming that the proximity to holy ground would sanctify the bathing experience. Some monasteries operated their own bathhouses, using the profits to fund religious activities while exposing their communities to disease and death. The most disturbing development was the emergence of penitential bathing, where people would deliberately seek out the most contaminated and dangerous bathhouses as a form of religious mortification. These spiritual athletes would compete to see who could endure the most polluted conditions, the highest temperatures, or the longest exposure to obviously diseased water. They believed that the greater their suffering during bathing, the more their sins would be forgiven and the closer they would come to divine grace. Penitential bathing cults developed elaborate hierarchies based on members' willingness to expose themselves to danger. Novice members might start by bathing in moderately contaminated water or staying in hot pools until they fainted. Advanced practitioners would seek, as had been found, believing that proximity to death would enhance their spiritual purification. The most extreme devotees would deliberately infect themselves with diseases from other bathers, seeing illness as a form of divine communion. These religious bathing practices created some of the most horrific scenes in medieval European history. Chroniclers describe gatherings where hundreds of people would crowd into small, overheated pools, deliberately sharing bodily fluids and exposing themselves to every disease present in the group. The mortality rate at these events was staggering, but survivors were treated as living saints who had achieved a higher level of spiritual development through their willingness to risk everything for purification. The economic impact of this religious bathhouse culture was enormous. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to visit bathhouses that were rumored to provide the most intense spiritual experiences, bringing money to local communities while also bringing diseases from distant regions. These pilgrimage bathhouses became centers of both commerce and contagion, spreading exotic diseases across trade routes and creating new patterns of epidemic disease that medieval authorities couldn't understand or control. The taxation and regulation of bathhouses created additional layers of corruption and exploitation. Local authorities quickly realized that bathhouse owners would pay substantial bribes to avoid health inspections or to have dangerous conditions overlooked. The officials responsible for monitoring public health often had financial interests in the bathhouses they were supposed to regulate, creating conflicts of interest that ensured dangerous practices would continue unchecked. Some cities developed elaborate systems of bathhouse licensing that were designed more to generate revenue than to protect public health. Licenses would be sold to the highest bidders regardless of their qualifications or the safety of their facilities. The licensing fees were often so high that only the most profitable bathhouses could afford them, creating incentives for operators to maximize customer volume and minimize maintenance costs, leading inevitably to more dangerous conditions. The legal system's response to bathhouse-related deaths and injuries reveals the medieval world's fundamental inability to understand or address the public health crisis they had created. When customers died from obvious poisoning or infection, their families could sometimes sue for damages, but the legal standards for proving negligence were so high that successful cases were rare. Bathhouse owners learned to protect themselves by requiring customers to sign waivers acknowledging the spiritual nature of bathing and accepting responsibility for any consequences. Courts would often rule that deaths occurring in bathhouses were acts of God rather than results of human negligence, especially if the deceased had been seeking religious purification rather than simple cleanliness. This legal framework meant that bathhouse operators could maintain obviously lethal conditions with minimal risk of punishment, while victims and their families had little recourse for seeking justice or compensation. The international trade in bathhouse supplies created a global network of exploitation that extended the medieval bathing crisis far beyond Europe. Exotic herbs, Oils and other additives were imported from Asia and Africa, often carrying their own diseases and parasites that found new hosts in European bathhouse environments. The demand for these luxury bathing products created incentives for suppliers to ship increasingly dangerous materials, knowing that European customers would pay premium prices for anything that promised enhanced purification. Medieval bathhouses thus became laboratories for biological warfare, where diseases from across the known world could meet, mutate, and spread to new populations. The global trade networks that supplied bathhouse luxuries also provided pathways for pandemic diseases to spread faster and farther than ever before in human history, turning local health crises into continental catastrophes that shaped the demographic and cultural development of entire civilizations. As we delve deeper into this world of contaminated luxury and deadly purification, the true scope of medieval bathing culture's impact becomes clear. What began as a simple desire for cleanliness had evolved into a complex system of social, economic, religious, and medical practices that touched every aspect of medieval life, usually making it worse. But the worst was yet to come, as the Black Death approached and medieval bathhouses would play a crucial role in one of history's most devastating pandemics. The approaching storm of the Black Death would reveal just how catastrophically medieval bathing culture had prepared European society for demographic annihilation. But even before the plague arrived, the day-to-day operations of bathhouses had created a perfect training ground for pandemic spread that would make the 14th century's greatest catastrophe far worse than it might have been otherwise. The timing couldn't have been more tragic. Just as European cities were reaching their medieval population peaks, just as trade networks were connecting distant regions more efficiently than ever before, the bathhouse system had created urban populations that were immunologically compromised, socially conditioned to accept disease as normal, and medically managed by practitioners who actively promoted the very behaviors that would accelerate epidemic spread. Consider the psychological conditioning that regular bathhouse use had created among medieval urban populations. By the early 14th century, entire generations had grown up believing that illness following exposure to contaminated environments was not just normal but beneficial. When the first cases of plague appeared in European cities, many people initially interpreted the symptoms as signs that their bodies were undergoing the same purification process they had experienced countless times in bathhouses. The fever, the swollen lymph nodes, the skin discoloration. These matched the patterns that bathhouse patrons had learned to associate with spiritual cleansing and humoral rebalancing. Instead of fleeing from infected areas or isolating sick individuals, many communities initially responded to plague outbreaks by increasing their use of bathhouses, believing that more intensive purification would help them survive the crisis. This response was actively encouraged by the medical establishment that had developed around bathhouse culture. Physicians who had spent decades attributing bathhouse-related deaths to spiritual unworthiness rather than contamination now applied the same logic to plague victims. They prescribed increased bathing, bloodletting, and exposure to the same contaminated environments that had been killing their patients for generations, but now with the added urgency of a pandemic crisis. The social networks that bathhouses had created became highways for plague transmission. The wealthy merchants who traveled between cities for business had developed habits of visiting bathhouses in every major commercial center, creating a class of super spreaders who could carry the disease across vast distances while believing they were maintaining their health through proper hygiene. The bathhouse workers who moved between facilities to find employment carried infections from city to city, and the pilgrims who visited religious bathhouses created transmission routes that connected the most remote communities to urban disease centers. But the bathhouse system's contribution to the Black Death's devastation went beyond simple. The decades of contamination exposure had created urban populations whose immune systems were already compromised by chronic infections, parasitic infestations, and malnutrition caused by digestive disorders contracted in bathhouses. When plague arrived, it encountered populations that were uniquely vulnerable to rapid infection and death. The social hierarchies that bathhouses had reinforced also shaped how plague spread through communities. The wealthy, who had the best access to bathhouse facilities, were often the first to contract and spread the disease because their social habits involved the most exposure to contaminated environments. But when they began dying in large numbers, the economic and administrative systems they controlled collapsed, leaving the poor without the resources or organization needed to respond effectively to the crisis. The religious interpretations of bathing culture proved equally disastrous when applied to plague response. Communities that had learned to view disease as divine punishment or spiritual testing initially responded to plague outbreaks with increased religious fervor rather than practical public health measures. They organized mass bathing ceremonies intended to purify entire populations, creating super spreader events that accelerated transmission rates beyond anything that natural infection patterns would have produced. Some of the most horrific scenes of the Black Death period occurred in religious bathhouses where entire communities gathered to seek divine protection through collective purification. Chroniclers describe events where hundreds of people would crowd into single facilities, sharing contaminated water while praying for salvation, only to emerge carrying infections that would kill them and everyone they encountered over the following weeks. These religious bathing ceremonies became inadvertent suicide rituals that wiped out entire neighborhoods and sometimes entire towns. The economic disruption caused by plague deaths was amplified by the particular vulnerabilities that bathhouse culture had created in medieval urban economies. The merchant classes who had been the primary customers of bathhouses were also the people who maintained the trade networks, credit systems, and administrative structures that kept cities functioning. When plague killed them in disproportionate numbers, it didn't just reduce population, it specifically targeted the people whose knowledge and connections were essential for economic recovery. The bathhouse workers themselves, who had developed specialized knowledge about managing contaminated environments, might have been valuable resources for understanding and controlling plague transmission. But decades of exposure to bathhouse conditions had left most of them chronically ill and immunologically compromised, making them among the first victims when plague arrived. The few who survived often fled to rural areas, taking their practical knowledge about disease management with them and leaving urban communities without the expertise that might have helped them develop effective response strategies. The international connections that bathhouse luxury trades had created also accelerated plague transmission in ways that purely local epidemics never could have achieved. The same trade routes that brought exotic herbs and oils to European bathhouses also carried infected fleas, contaminated goods, and diseased travelers who spread plague faster and farther than any previous pandemic. The global supply chains that had developed around bathhouse culture became the arteries through which the Black Death reached every corner of the known world. Perhaps most tragically, the medical theories that had developed around bathhouse practices actively prevented effective plague response. Physicians trained in humoral theory continued to prescribe treatments that increased rather than decreased infection risk. They recommended bloodletting to reduce excess heat, purging to expel bad humors, and continued bathing to maintain proper spiritual balance. These treatments weakened patients' immune systems and increased their exposure to contaminated environments, virtually guaranteeing death for anyone who followed medical advice. The few medical practitioners who began to suspect that plague was transmitted through contact with infected people or contaminated materials found themselves opposed by an entire medical establishment that had been trained to view disease as spiritual rather than physical phenomenon. The scientific method of observation and hypothesis testing that might have led to effective plague control strategies was overwhelmed by religious and theoretical frameworks that had been developed specifically to rationalize the deaths caused by bathhouse culture. When plague finally began to recede in the late 14th century, European society faced a demographic and cultural catastrophe that was far worse than the disease alone would have caused. The bathhouse system had not only accelerated plague transmission, but had also eliminated many of the social, economic, and intellectual resources that societies needed for recovery. The communities that survived were often those that had been too poor or too isolated to participate fully in bathhouse culture, creating a post-plague Europe that was fundamentally different from the urban commercial civilization that had existed before. The psychological trauma of the plague years was amplified by the cognitive dissonance that bathhouse culture had created. People who had spent generations believing that illness was a sign of spiritual purification now faced a disease that killed indiscriminately, regardless of moral character or religious devotion. The theological frameworks that had made bathhouse-related suffering bearable proved inadequate for understanding a pandemic that seemed to contradict everything medieval people believed about the relationship between cleanliness, godliness, and health. Many plague survivors developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorders, but these were complicated by the specific beliefs and practices that bathhouse culture had embedded in their worldview. Some became obsessed with cleanliness rituals that were even more dangerous than traditional bathing practices, believing that their survival required increasingly extreme forms of purification. Others developed aversions to any form of washing or cleaning, convinced that their families had died because they had tried too hard to achieve cleanliness. The children who grew up during and after the plague years inherited a world where the basic assumptions about health and hygiene had been shattered but not replaced with anything more effective. They received conflicting messages about whether cleanliness was protective or dangerous, whether community gathering was beneficial or lethal, whether medical treatment was helpful or harmful. Many developed behavioral patterns that were simultaneously obsessive and neglectful, compulsively cleaning some aspects of their environment while ignoring obvious health hazards in others. The economic recovery that followed the Black Death was shaped by the particular ways that bathhouse culture had structured pre-plague society. The merchant classes that had supported elaborate bathhouse systems were gone, taking with them not just wealth, but also the social networks and cultural knowledge that had maintained urban civilization. The survivors often came from rural or artisan backgrounds that had different relationships with cleanliness, community, and commerce. These new urban populations developed bathing practices that were simultaneously more and less sophisticated than what had come before. They retained some of the technical knowledge about heating water and constructing bathing facilities, but they rejected much of the social and religious framework that had made pre-plague bathhouses so dangerous. The result was a patchwork of bathing customs that varied dramatically from community to community, creating a diversity of hygiene practices that would characterize European culture for centuries to come. The religious establishment also underwent fundamental changes as a result of plague experiences that had revealed the deadly consequences of bathhouse-related theology. Some religious authorities began promoting cleanliness practices that were more focused on individual rather than communal purification, recognizing that shared facilities had contributed to the disaster. Others moved in the opposite direction, viewing the plague as divine punishment for the pride and luxury that bathhouse culture had represented. The most significant change was the gradual recognition that disease could be transmitted through physical contact rather than spiritual influence. This understanding developed slowly and unevenly, often opposed by established medical and religious authorities who had built their careers on humoral theory and spiritual interpretations of illness. But the scale of plague mortality made it impossible to ignore the connection between contaminated environments and disease transmission. The technological innovations that emerged from post-plague European society reflected these changing attitudes toward cleanliness and contagion. New methods for heating water, constructing drainage systems, and managing waste disposal showed increased awareness of the practical rather than spiritual aspects of hygiene. The elaborate social and religious ceremonies that had characterized medieval bathhouses were replaced by more utilitarian approaches that prioritized effectiveness over symbolism. But these technological improvements came at enormous human cost. The knowledge that was lost when plague killed the craftsmen, engineers, and administrators who had maintained medieval bathhouse systems was never fully recovered. Many of the technical innovations that had made medieval bathing possible were forgotten, leaving later generations to rediscover basic principles of hydraulics, heating, and construction that had been common knowledge before the plague. The artistic and literary traditions that had developed around bathhouse culture also disappeared with the social classes that had supported them. The elaborate bathing ceremonies, the poetry and music that had accompanied communal washing, the architectural innovations that had made bathhouses centers of urban beauty. All of these cultural achievements were lost when plague destroyed the communities that had created and maintained them. The legal and administrative systems that had regulated medieval bathhouses were similarly disrupted by plague mortality. The judges, lawyers, and bureaucrats who had developed expertise in managing the complex legal issues surrounding bathhouse operation were among the urban elites who died in disproportionate numbers. The legal precedents and administrative procedures they had created were often lost along with the people who understood how to apply. This loss of institutional knowledge created opportunities for different approaches to public health regulation, but also eliminated much of the legal framework that might have prevented future disasters. Post-plague European communities often had to reinvent basic concepts of public health law without the benefit of previous experience or established legal principles. The international diplomatic relationships that had developed around bathhouse trade and regulation were also severed by plague disruption. The treaties, commercial agreements, and cultural exchanges that had connected European bathhouse systems to broader Mediterranean and Asian networks collapsed when the people who maintained these relationships died or fled. This isolation forced European communities to develop more self-sufficient approaches to bathing technology and hygiene practices. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the bathhouse system's role in the Black Death was the fundamental change it created in European attitudes toward risk, community, and individual responsibility. The pre-plague world had been characterized by acceptance of communal risk-taking, where individuals were expected to participate in dangerous social activities for the supposed benefit of the group. The post-plague world was marked by increased skepticism about collective activities and greater emphasis on individual protection and family-level decision-making. This shift toward individualism was accelerated by the specific ways that bathhouse culture had failed during the plague years. People had learned that following expert advice, participating in community activities, and trusting established institutions could be lethal. The survivors developed habits of skepticism and self-reliance that would characterize European culture for centuries to come, shaping everything from religious practice to commercial relationships to political organization. The Black Death had revealed the true cost of medieval bathing culture, but the lessons learned from this catastrophe would take generations to fully understand and implement. The immediate aftermath was a world where the old certainties about cleanliness, community, and health had been shattered, leaving survivors to rebuild not just their cities and economies, but their most basic assumptions about how human societies should organize themselves to survive and thrive. Yet even as the plague years ended and European communities began the long process of recovery, the fundamental problems that had made bathhouse culture so dangerous remained largely unrecognized. The scientific understanding of disease transmission was still centuries away, and the social and economic forces that had created medieval bathhouse systems continued to operate in new forms. The stage was set for the new kinds of hygiene-related disasters that would plague European society well into the modern era. The survivors of the Black Death had learned the hard way that their ancestors' pursuit of cleanliness had become a pathway to death. But the lessons they drew from this catastrophe were often as dangerous as the original practices they were trying to replace. Without understanding the actual mechanisms of disease transmission, post-plague communities developed new bathing rituals that were sometimes even more hazardous than what had come before. Consider the emergence of purification by fire practices that developed in many post-plague communities. Convinced that water itself had become cursed or contaminated beyond redemption, some groups began experimenting with dry heat treatments that involved exposing themselves to temperatures that could literally cook human flesh. These fire purification ceremonies took place in specially constructed chambers where participants would sit in air heated to levels that caused severe burns, dehydration, and often death. The practitioners believed that if water-based purification had failed to protect them from plague, perhaps fire-based cleansing would prove more effective. They developed elaborate theories about how different types of heat could drive out different categories of spirit, leading to increasingly extreme experiments with temperature and duration that killed more people than they saved. Meanwhile, other communities went in the opposite direction, developing natural purification practices that rejected all artificial heating or constructed facilities. These groups would gather at rivers, lakes, or coastal areas during the coldest months of the year, believing that exposure to completely natural conditions would provide the spiritual cleansing that artificial bathhouses had failed to deliver. The mortality rates from these winter bathing rituals were staggering. Hypothermia, drowning, and exposure-related illnesses killed participants regularly, but survivors interpreted these deaths as evidence that the deceased had been spiritually unworthy rather than recognizing the obvious physical dangers of their practices. Some communities lost entire generations to these natural purification experiments, creating demographic gaps that took centuries to recover from. The economic aftermath of the bathhouse collapse created new forms of exploitation that were often more predatory than the original system. Entrepreneurs who claimed to have discovered plague-proof cleaning methods would travel from community to community, selling expensive treatments that were usually more dangerous than traditional bathing. These traveling purification merchants preyed on communities that were desperate for alternatives to the bathhouse systems that had failed them so catastrophically. One particularly horrific example involved a group of charlatans who convinced several French communities that rubbing mercury into the skin would provide permanent protection against all diseases. The mercury poisoning that resulted from these treatments caused madness, organ failure, and death, but the symptoms developed slowly enough that victims often didn't connect their suffering to the purification treatments they had received months earlier. The religious implications of the bathhouse catastrophe also created new forms of spiritual exploitation. Corrupt religious authorities began selling indulgences that supposedly protected buyers from the spiritual contamination that had made bathhouse-related deaths possible. These indulgences were often expensive enough to bankrupt entire families, but desperate survivors were willing to pay anything for the promise of protection from future purification-related disasters. Some religious orders developed monastic communities specifically devoted to discovering new forms of safe purification. These experimental monasteries became laboratories for testing increasingly bizarre cleansing rituals on their own members. The mortality rates in these communities were extraordinary, but the few survivors often achieved positions of religious authority based on their supposed expertise in spiritual purification. The children who grew up in this post-bathhouse world inherited trauma responses that would shape European culture for generations. Many developed obsessive-compulsive behaviors around cleanliness that were simultaneously excessive and ineffective. They would spend hours each day performing elaborate washing rituals that did nothing to prevent disease transmission, while neglecting basic sanitation practices that might have actually protected their health. Others developed the opposite response, becoming so afraid of water and communal activities that they lived in states of filth that were arguably worse than anything their medieval ancestors had experienced. These hygiene-averse communities often suffered from preventable diseases that proper washing could have eliminated, creating cycles of illness and death that were entirely self-imposed. The knowledge systems that emerged from the bathhouse catastrophe were characterized by a fundamental confusion between correlation and causation that would plague European medical thinking for centuries. People had observed that bathhouse use was associated with disease and death, but without understanding the mechanisms involved, they often drew conclusions that were exactly wrong. For example, many communities concluded that heating water was inherently dangerous, leading them to develop cold water bathing practices that failed to kill parasites and bacteria. Others decided that communal activities were fundamentally cursed, leading to social isolation practices that prevented the cooperation necessary for effective public health measures. The most tragic legacy of medieval bathhouse culture wasn't just the immediate death and suffering it caused, but the way it poisoned European attitudes toward cleanliness, community, and scientific inquiry for centuries to come. The survivors of the bathhouse catastrophe had learned to distrust expertise, to fear innovation, and to interpret any new approach to hygiene as potentially lethal. This legacy of fear and suspicion would make it incredibly difficult for later generations to develop effective public health practices, even when better scientific understanding became available. The trauma of the medieval bathing disaster had created cultural antibodies against precisely the kind of systematic thinking and community cooperation that would be necessary for genuine improvements in hygiene and disease prevention. As we close this dark chapter of human history, we're left with a sobering reminder of how good intentions combined with ignorance can create disasters that echo through generations. The medieval Europeans who built elaborate bathhouse systems weren't monsters. They were people trying to solve real problems with the knowledge available to them. But their solutions became traps that consumed entire civilizations. The next time you turn on a hot shower or fill a clean bathtub, remember the countless people who died in pursuit of the simple human desire to be clean. Their suffering wasn't meaningless if we learn from their mistakes, and remember that progress in public health requires not just good intentions, but rigorous scientific understanding and the humility to admit when our current practices might be doing more harm than good. The medieval bathhouse catastrophe stands as one of history's most powerful reminders that the road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions, and that sometimes the cure really can be worse than the disease. In trying to wash away their sins, medieval Europeans nearly washed away their entire civilization. May we be wiser than our ancestors, and may we never forget the price they paid for lessons we now take for granted.